Hi, and welcome to podcast 2, which has the title of Purpose and Meaning. But before that, just like to catch up where we were at the end of podcast 1. So I thought that I remembered who I am in truth. I remembered who everyone is in truth. My home, which was definitely not on planet Earth. And wow. Sort of thought I'd made it. I remembered everything's fine. But then, of course, with a mind like mine, particularly, I started thinking further. And that is, well, this experiences of feeling home, remembering who I am, who everyone is, was that an authentic knowing, or was it a creative sense of knowing? Was it another trick of the perceptional or created, controlled, hallucinatory capacity of my mind? Mm. So, yeah, I discovered that every human has a self-cognition. You can observe yourself, you can observe your thought processes. But does that mean you're out of the matrix of that consciousness of mind? Hmm. So I really thought I'd solved my problem. But then I realized, well, I had that moment, but now where do I find myself? Back on planet Earth, back in that, train of relativity, where everything inside the train seems to be consistent. But if you would look from the outside, you go like, oh my God, no, it's moving at a certain speed. Um, it's totally relative to being on the train inside. Um, the the first 10,000 kilometers between the crust of the Earth and outer space. So yes, what I did next, and therefore this podcast, is to look at consciousness. Where does it really come from? What is the origin? What's the source of consciousness? Um, will this be a chicken or the egg question or something completely different? So uh, that's what I will present next. I'm going through um, the categories of consciousness, because someone who did this for us, he found there was more than 325 theories. So he categorized them and then looked at all these sub um, categories under the main category. So, hey, it's human beings together. We don't really tend to agree with each other. A lot of people want to create a group of followers, so they will do it just a little bit different than the other guy, or drastically different than the other guy. It's all there. But for me to um, continue my quest to solve my problem, I'm now going to take you through consciousness first before we're going to look at purpose and meaning.
The hard problem of consciousness is the problem of how physical processes in the brain give rise to the subjective experience of the mind and of the world. If you look at the brain from the outside, you see this extraordinary machine, an organ consisting of 84 billion neurons that fire in synchrony with each other. When I see, visual inputs come to my eyes, photons hit my eyes, they send a signal that goes up the optic nerve to the back of my brain. It sends neural firings propagating throughout my brain, and eventually I might produce an action. From the outside, though, I look like a complicated mechanism, a robot. This is how science might describe me from the objective point of view. But there's also a subjective point of view. There's what it feels like for the agent who is seeing the scene. When I see you, I see colors, I see shapes, I have an experience from a first-person point of view. There's something it's like to be me. And this is the conscious experience of seeing. It's part of the inner movie of the mind. This inner movie has many, many dimensions. It has the dimension of vision, it has the dimension of sound, like a normal movie, but it also has touch and taste and smell. It has emotions, it has thought, it has a sense of one's body. All of this is subjective experience. And it's one of the most familiar facts in the world that we have this subjective experience. But it's also one of the most mysterious. Why is it that these physical processes in the brain should produce subjective experience?
The hard problem of consciousness. And we're looking here at the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and it's peer-reviewed, so it's the best resource I could find to present you the so-called hard problem of consciousness. So what is it? Well, it is the problem of explaining why any physical state is conscious rather than non-conscious. So it's the problem of explaining why there is such a thing as something is like for a subject. It's more like, what is it like to be me? What is it like to be you? What is it like to be us? So it's a first person point of view. So in science we speak about first person point of view, which means like I'm becoming self-aware, which is different than me becoming aware of a third person. So in the third person I observe behavior, but a first person consciousness, it's cognition. It's about all of my mental processes and thinking that is not obvious if I just observe behavior. So behavior is relatively easy, and regular science can apply its methods to it. It usually involves explanation of functional, dynamical and structural properties. So in other words, explanation of what a thing does, how it changes over time, how it is put together. But even after we have explained the functional, dynamical and structural properties of the conscious mind, we can still meaningfully ask the question, why is it conscious? Alright, this suggests that an explanation of consciousness will have to go beyond the usual methods of science. So, a person named Robert Lawrence Kuhn, he is the first person who's trying to map and organize and categorize over 325 different theories of or on consciousness. And he's come up with 10 categories, and we're gonna look at those individually. Start with materialism and it's go all the way through to idealisms and so forth. And again, it's important to see what your personal understanding and conceptualization is of consciousness, because it will determine highly influence your ideas, your vision on purpose and meaning. So,
if we were going to have a successful theory of consciousness, it was going to have to be counterintuitive. Hard to believe at first because our intuitions tell us so strongly facts about our minds that just aren't facts, they aren't true. And I think the most potent and seductive is the idea that inside our heads, somewhere, there is a sort of show going on. Colors and shapes and sounds and itches and tingles are happening in a special, private, subjective arena. And we are the audience. Each of us is the audience for that set of apparitions, appearances, representations. I call that place the Cartesian theater. It's the mind as Descartes conceived of it in the 17th century. There's no such place. It seems to stand to reason. There has to be. Look, I can close my eyes and there I am. I'm in that place. Well, you think you are. That's what you think's going on. Here's what's really going on, blah, blah, blah. Oh, there's more. There's more. You're leaving something important out. And it's this hunch that there's something more beyond the spike trains and the coordinating activity of the nervous system. There's got to be this extra wonderful layer that makes life worth living. That intuition is almost universal and very potent and simply wrong. And so a large part of my work is engaged in trying to show people, to their initial amazement and disbelief, that they're actually wrong about that.
So, here we are. Fundamental theories, materialism, all the way to challenges. So let's go to materialism. So materialism is consciousness as a physical phenomenon. So materialism, in the monistic view that matter is fundamental and mind and consciousness are entirely products of material processes, has the view that conscious mental activity is identical with neural activity in the brain. So later we'll look at dualism and idealism. We treat consciousness really differently. So materialists argue that as neuroscience advances, it will fully explain consciousness in terms of brain events, or even that our very concepts of mind will be refined or replaced by physical terms. So really we don't have a good model of mind. And anyway, this is the materialist framework. And the core position is that there is no non-physical mind stuff separate from the body. So what we call the mind is simply the functioning of the physical brain. So there you go. Epicurus would probably be a materialist kind of thinker. So that's number one.
I've said that consciousness, human consciousness, is a fact of the world, a datum, that every theory of reality must explain in order to be coherent. Do you agree with that?
No, I don't. I think that consciousness is something that has emerged late in the universe, that it is a property of only the higher biological organisms, and biology and neurophysiology need to work at explaining it, but I don't think it's relevant to chemistry, and only very rare interpretations of physics, as I understand it, involve consciousness.
But you would then exclude the existence of consciousness as something that was a primary part of our total existence in the universe to be able to explain through some mechanism, whether it's physicalist or creator or some spiritual existence. It's not at the level of relevance to do that.
It's only relevant to certain particular kinds of inquiries.
And you can deal with the question of whether God exists, or whether there's a spiritual realm, or whether everything is just physical. You can deal with those questions, and you don't have to bring consciousness into the equation to consider.
I don't think so. Of course, if you weren't conscious, you wouldn't ask the question whether God exists or not.
Sure, understand that.
But I don't think that the existence of consciousness is itself a necessary step in arguing for the existence of God.
Which means that consciousness is a derived quality from other things, and is not
Yes.
a primary quality. If it were a primary quality, then you would have to explain it in your total explanation.
It just depends on what kind of explanation you're trying to give. Now, if you wanted to explain the whole of reality, for instance, come up with a theory of everything, but only explain it in terms of its material existence, you don't need to invoke consciousness.
Well, if I want to choose between a materialistic view or a theistic view or a deistic view, if I'm interested in knowing whether the physical world is all there is, or whether there is another reality, do I or not need to consider the existence of consciousness?
I don't think so.
Great.
Then we have this non-reductive physicalism, which means consciousness goes beyond reduction. So consciousness emerges from physical systems while it maintains irreducible properties. So what does that really mean? Well, non-reductive physicalism offers a compelling middle ground in the philosophy of mind. So it maintains that consciousness is entirely physical in nature, but it also acknowledges that mental properties cannot be fully reduced to or explained by physical properties alone. So, reductive physicalism, which is a bit like materialism, claims mental states are nothing but physical states. And dualism poses that mental substances are separate from physical reality. So we'll go into that later. Now, the core position. Consciousness is 100% physical in its ontology, But mental properties are not reducible to physical properties. They require their own level of explanation and possess causal efficacy. So you can see here a few key concepts: so supervenience. Mental properties depend on physical properties. No mental change without some physical change, but they are not identical to them. The multiple realizability. So the same mental state can be realized by different physical substrates across species or even artificial systems. So we're looking at things like pain. The explanatory gap. Even complete physical knowledge may not fully explain subjective experience, suggesting an epistemic and not an ontological gap. And then downward causation. Mental states can causally influence physical states without violating physical laws. Mental causation is real. And here, some people who are all
asked us to consider that real activity is happening at the quantum level. And I have to ask, why do we need that? Because quantum effects are everywhere. Why is it so special in the brain to understand how consciousness works?
Well, the idea that I had, because of my views about understanding being something which is not a computational activity, I needed something which involved that part of physics which, in my view, had a hope of being non-computational. And the only part of physics is that I could think of then and can still only think of now is where you have a quantum system which becomes a classical system. See, this is one of the big puzzles of quantum mechanics. How is it that you have these rules like, Schrödinger's cat being dead and alive at the same time, which are what you get from quantum mechanics, but you don't see them at the classical level.
Yes.
So there's something missing in the gap between quantum and classical. Now, the question is my argument would be that the physics that is missing about how the quantum world becomes the classical world is something which I think is the only place where you would have non-computational activity. Mm-hmm. So if we think non-computationally, we must be making use of whatever that physics is that goes from the quantum to the classical world. Now, that's a big, tall order, because it means that in the brain, we have to sustain a quantum system to such a degree that whatever this new physics is, it comes in and becomes relevant. Whereas usually what happens is the quantum system becomes entangled with the world, the environment, and you lose all what people call environmental decoherence. Mm-hmm. And when that happens, you lose the information that would be relevant in the new physics. So you've got to keep your quantum system going for that degree so that the new physics actually comes in usefully. Now, I wrote my book, The Emperor's New Mind, in a way trying to explore this, hoping that by the time I got to the end of the book, I would know what it was. But I learned various things when I was writing my book about the brain and what people thought about it, but I didn't get to, I simply didn't get a good reason for what. So the thing is, neurons, clearly, at least what I learned about neurons, clearly the firing of a neuron will disturb the environment in the brain, and there's no chance of keeping this coherence. So it needed something more. So the book was a failure in that particular respect, except that Stuart Hameroff read my book, and he wrote to me and said, I think you may not know about these things called microtubules. And I said, well, actually, I don't know about them. In my ignorance, I'd never heard of them. I thought, is this another nut? I get letters from various people that I have to discard like this, but then, here are pictures of them. Gosh, they must be real. And so I said, this sounds extremely interesting. There's a much better chance. You have these little tubes, they're very symmetrical structures, they're much smaller. There's a reasonable chance, I didn't see how in detail, but a reasonable chance that here you have something which could preserve quantum coherence up to the level where the new physics would come in. So the non-computational behavior, at least there's a chance. And so Stuart came over to Oxford and we had a long...
Fans of this particular theory. So now we're going to quantum consciousness. And it says here, the search for agency in physics. And on my YouTube channel, I have done videos on determinism versus free will. And all of the people that are involved in that particular video will say the same thing. Everything is deterministic. We don't really have free will. But the idea of agency, and that we have free will, gets then argued by people who say, hang on, there is this thing of quantum physics and quantum mechanics. And so the theory is that the idea of quantum consciousness often gets dismissed as pseudoscience, but there is a core value that gets missed. So it is frequently portrayed as a solution to the hard problem of subjective experience. And its real power lies in addressing what is called the agency problem. How we can possibly be genuine authors of our thoughts and actions in a physical universe. So it goes into the Mitchell's perspective, but I think to understand quantum a little bit, because I don't think it's understandable really. I know you can watch lots of things of it and pretend that you understand it and explain it, but I think that is the Dunning-Kruger effect in action. So superposition. So quantum systems exist in multiple states simultaneously until measured or interacting with their environment. So that's very interesting. And it's the wave function collapse. So it's a double slit experiment. You let light get through two splits and you see patterns of projection on the screen, projector screen, that are evidence that light is a waveform. But as soon as you start putting in observers, which can just be a machine or a device, doesn't have to be a human being, the waveforms collapses and there's only two slits on the projector screen, suggesting that light is just a bundle of particles. So the transition from multiple possibilities to a single outcome. But what triggers this collapse remains mysterious. Alright, and then quantum entanglement. Particles become interconnected in ways that defy classical explanation, suggesting non-local connections. So if you go on YouTube or the popular books, there's so much stuff where they say, oh, this is quantum and this explains this and this and this. And to be honest, no. That's just that particular person trying to make you a follower of their interpretation. But yes, these properties could provide a physical substrate for genuine choice, but if consciousness can influence quantum processes, or on the other hand, if it emerges from them, it might leverage this indeterminacy to make non-deterministic decisions. Okay, so I don't want to go into it, but you see there's lots of more stuff on it.
first had to get down to the basics of consciousness.
There's no Turing test for consciousness. The problem of consciousness is not just what most people think, oh, you have to explain how anything can be conscious. That is a problem. But then you also have to explain in each case, why is the particular conscious experience the way it is?
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
Whether I'm on mushroom or angry, these are different experiences,
Yeah,
and you have to explain how I can have different experiences.
Yeah. We tend to believe that if a system behaves conscious, it might be conscious. Now, IIT doesn't want to take consciousness at face value.
It's not about behavior. Ultimately, you have to look at the hardware level. You have to look at the level where the rubber meets the road. You actually have to look at one transistor acting on other transistors.
According to IIT, consciousness has to do with the interconnectedness of the hardware of a system, its integrated information. It measures this as phi. Now, what makes the theory widely applicable is that any system, not only brains, has a phi.
Consciousness may be much more widespread than we think.
Yeah.
A single cell bacteria may already feel like something.
Now, where IIT to me becomes really fascinating is that it has no theoretical objections to the idea of a higher form of mind that extends beyond our brains. And a larger consciousness, as you said earlier, would wipe out sort of, if we, the two of us, connect, sort of, and it becomes this new maximum integrated information, it will wipe out our conscious experience.
Correct. Suddenly the complexity, this phi measure of our integrated brain, will exceed that of my brain by itself and of your brain by itself. At that point, what will happen? Hans, gone. Christoph, gone. Instead, there will be this new Ubermind, okay, this new amalgamation of Hans and Christoph that'll see out of 4 eyes, that'll have 2 mouths, etc.
Christoph Koch is a brilliant, open-minded scientist. But what made this conversation really stand out for me is that he also knows the moment where art sometimes better describes the depth of human consciousness than science. And as a German, he knows his classics.
To quote from the second act of Tristan und Isolde, selbst dann bin ich die Welt. That's exactly
The title
then
of your
I
new
am
book.
the
Yeah.
title of my next book. Then I am the world, because then I experience the world and me as being identical.
Did you have that experience?
Yes, I did.
So that's quantum. And then we go into ITT, Integrated Information Theory. So consciousness is an integrated information. So what does that really mean? Well, exploring how consciousness arises from the capacity of systems to integrate information. So we're going into mathematics here. So IoT proposes that consciousness corresponds to the capacity of a system to integrate information. It was developed by a neuroscientist, Giulio Tononi, and it provides both a theoretical framework and a mathematical measure. It's phi, and phi will quantify the consciousness. Unlike other theories that focus on specific neural correlates or functional rules, IIT starts from the essential properties of consciousness itself, and then it works backward to determine what physical systems could support it. So, the theory makes this claim that consciousness is identical to a system's integrated information. And the core proposition is there that the quantity and quality of consciousness are determined by a system's phi value, its capacity for integrated information. So a system is conscious to the extent that it can generate more information as a whole than the sum of its parts. Okay, it's a very brainy kind of theory, but let's just look at a few implications. Consciousness is not something we infer from behavior, but something that exists in itself. Okay, every conscious experience consists of various elements like color, shape, sounds, all bound together, and consciousness is not generic but highly specific in its content. So, integration, well, you cannot experience the left visual field separately from the right. And exclusion, consciousness has specific boundaries. you're either conscious of something or you're not. And so here we see people who are really proponents or have contributed. So Giulio Tononi, but also Christoph Koch, Melanie Boyle, and Larissa Abantakis. Okay.
Waiting for, go back to sleep, thinking nothing. And all of a sudden, out of the chest, just energy was coming out of my chest, but it was love. And it was love that was never felt before. It was love that was coming from me. How can love come from me? I mean, it was unthinkable that love could come from me. And it was 10,000 times more powerful than any love that I felt before. I mean, in fact, I never felt that love because it was unconditional love. Now I have a name for it. It was love, period. Yes, it was coming from me, but it was love. And it was light. It was a white light scintillating. It was, like sparkles, and it was coming out. And then it explodes and it's everywhere. But it's everywhere, but my consciousness is there too. So not only my consciousness is within me, but it's also outside of me. And all of a sudden I realize I am that. So I am the observer and the observed simultaneously. But I retain my point of view. And then I realize, oh my God, this stuff is the stuff of which everything is made. Everything comes from this stuff. And my body was hot, it was vibrating, like the cells of my body were resonating with this thing. Of course, the emotion, the feelings was love, joy, and peace. Because this stuff felt like, that's me, I'm at home, this is me. So I'm finally home, this is this is home. But so it was all mixed up.
What happens, for people to understand, what happens when we die? And they say
we don't go anywhere because we never were in the body. It's the body that dies. We don't die. The real world.
Were you happy with the movie The Matrix, what it did sort of culturally with that metaphor?
The Matrix really does open people's minds up to the possibility that what they're experiencing is just a simulation, right? Now, in the Matrix, though, once you pop out of the simulation, it's another space-time world. So when Neo takes off the headset, he's back in a space-time world.
Welcome to the real world.
So it's Trinity and everybody, they're all in a space-time world. So this, what I'm saying, is even more radical, that whatever is beyond space-time is utterly unlike space and time.
But this is like fundamental stuff, right? This is the real cool stuff. We're still thinking of traveling in space-time, and we have all these space-time fantasies, right? And
most of the galaxies that we can see, we could never go to. Space is expanding so quickly that we could never get to them through space, moving at the speed of light. So there's all this real estate out there that we can see that's waving at us and saying, nanny, nanny, you can never get here. Well, that's if you go through space-time. But if space-time is just a headset, think about the options that come. You don't have to go through space-time, you could go around space-time. When we let go of the physicalist framework and we say, no, I am consciousness, I transcend this. Death is just stepping out of this headset. In other words, we're wired up to take the headset seriously. And so consciousness sort of wired itself up to take the headset seriously. But part of the waking up process is to step back and go, oh, wow, okay, oh, no, I'm not a little thing inside the headset. The headset is inside of me. I'm eventually going to take the headset off. So I can have a looser relationship with all this stuff. I don't need to get that big house to be something. I don't need to have that big scientific paper. I don't need to be acknowledged.
Don't feel bad if you don't really understand these theories, because hey, it's a theory. People have thought over it, put mathematics in it, try to put it all together. But it's good to become aware that there are all of these theories. So that's called Panpsychism, consciousness as a fundamental agent. So this is the proposal. Panpsychism proposes that consciousness is fundamental and ubiquitous in the natural world. Unlike the materialist theories that try to explain how consciousness emerges from non-conscious matter, Panpsychism suggests that consciousness was here first. It's a basic feature of reality, and it exists at all scales, from subatomic particles to human brains. So, the hard problem of consciousness is now debunked with the idea that there is no hard problem. Consciousness doesn't need to emerge from non-conscious matter, because matter already has some form of consciousness or proto-consciousness as one of its fundamental properties. So the core proposition here is that consciousness is fundamental to reality. It doesn't emerge from it. So just as mass and charge and spin are basic properties of matter, so too is some form of consciousness or experience. And then there's all these different variations. And here we see people who are proponents who have contributed. David Chalmers, that's the guy who formulated the hard problem, Galen Strawson, Philip Goff, Annika Harris, and I've used some interviews with Annika Harris in the podcast, Rupert Sheldrake and Alfred North Whitehead. Okay.
First, because, as I say, it keeps you realizing that there are very big and very important questions that science, at any rate at present, can't deal with, and that a scientific attitude by itself is not adequate. And the second thing it does is to make people a little more modest intellectually and aware that a great many things which have been thought certain turned out to be untrue, and that there's no shortcut to knowledge, and that the understanding of the world, which to my mind is the underlying purpose that every philosopher should have, that is a very long and difficult business about which we ought not to be dogmatic.
Most Christian traditions operate with the impulse to escape time, to something beyond time. And eternity up above means timelessness up above. And in order to reach that, They tell you we have to detach ourselves from the earthly things. And they don't even have an interest in what's happening in the universe. And they're trying to, like he said, escape time where he feels God has entered into time through Christ in order to fulfill what he is doing us in this time.
So we're halfway through. Now, monism, the unity of consciousness and reality, the one and the many. So monism posits that reality is fundamentally one. A single substance or principle underlies all existence, including both mind and matter. Unlike dualism, which separates mind and body, or pluralism, which posits multiple fundamental realities, monism seeks to explain how consciousness and physical reality emerge from a unified foundation. So, the monist approaches to consciousness represent some of the most sophisticated attempts to bridge the explanatory gap between subjective experience and objective reality. By positing a common ground for both mental and physical phenomena, monism offers elegant solutions to traditional mind-body problems. So, the proposition here is there is only one kind of fundamental substance or principle in reality. Consciousness and matter are different aspects, manifestations or organizations of this single underlying reality. Alright. So here it will say things like physics tells us what matter does, not what it is. The intrinsic nature of matter might be consciousness or proto-consciousness. Mind and matter are different arrangements or perspectives on the same neutral stuff, two languages describing one reality. Consciousness is what certain complex physical systems do. It's not a separate substance, but a pattern of physical organization. Or consciousness is primary, matter is merely how consciousness appears to itself under certain conditions. Right, so we have Bertrand Russell, Donald Davidson, Max Wellman, Galen Strawson, John Polkinghorne, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, Harold Altmannspacher, Adam Chandran, Max Tegmark, David Medley Hart, and John Leslie. Okay.
It is conceivable that while I have a body, suddenly that body is destroyed and I continue to exist. Now, it's conceivable that, he means it's logically possible, there's no contradiction. Now, if it were the case that now I didn't have a soul, then there would be a contradiction in supposing I could continue to exist when my body is destroyed, because there wouldn't be anything for me to continue to exist. So it must be the case, not merely that it's logically possible that I continue to exist, but I must actually continue to exist if it is to be logically possible that I can continue to exist without a soul. I think the way to approach it is this. Look, what would make, when you're looking forward to your future existence, what would you think is vital to that, which would make it you? And obviously you would say, well, it wouldn't I don't mind whether this body goes on existing unless I have thoughts and feelings and experiences and so on. And it's not too vital to me whether the body is connected or not. I think of when somebody wants to survive death, what they want is to go on experiencing, and therefore their very conception of themselves is as a subject of experience. That's what they understand by themselves. And they're aware of themselves as people who think, and what they are aware of in being aware of themselves is as a subject of experience. And that, of course, doesn't show that they will go on living after death, but it does show that there must be something about them which is such that it wouldn't be contradictory to suppose that they could go on living after death. And since it wouldn't be contradictory to suppose they could go on living after death if the body was destroyed, it must be that they already have another part, otherwise it would be. And you can get people to understand that if you re-express it in a number of different ways.
So you can look these people up and read on from that. So, come now to dualism. That's the two substances. So dualism posits that reality consists of two fundamentally different kinds of substance, mental and physical. Now, unlike monism, which seeks a unified foundation, dualism maintains that consciousness cannot be reduced to or fully explained by physical processes alone. So the dualist position, most famously articulated by René Descartes, argues that the mind or soul is a non-physical substance distinct from the body. So this view has persisted through centuries of philosophical and religious thought, continually adapting to new scientific discoveries while maintaining the fundamental distinction between mental and physical realms. So, core proposition. Mind and matter are fundamentally different kinds of reality. Consciousness is not merely a product of brain activity, but represents a distinct ontological category with its own properties and causal powers. Now we have all these different types of realms, and here some key philosophical proponents: Richard Swinburne, Eleanor Stump, Edward Feser, J.P. Moreland, Amy Kind. Yeah, and here religious and cultural dualist traditions: Jewish, Christian, Islamic, Eastern and indigenous traditions. Yeah, okay.
world is not physical, it is not material. It is material only in the colloquial sense, in the sense that there are colloquially material things around us, but they are not quantitative in essence. They must be qualitative in essence, because qualities is all we really know by direct acquaintance. Qualities are nature's given, they precede theory. Qualities are what we have before we begin abstracting and theorizing. So what is this qualitative world? How can we make sense of the fact that we seem to inhabit the same world? That's what I'm going to talk about now. That's the philosophy of analytic idealism, which I argue for. Let's start from the beginning. There is an objective world out there beyond our individual minds. That is self-evident. If you were where I am right now, you would describe the building where I am in a way very consistent with my own description of it. So clearly, we inhabit a world that is beyond us, that is beyond our individual minds. But the fact that it is outside our individual minds does not mean that it is non-mental. The thoughts of another person are outside your individual mind, but they are mental. The emotions of your neighbor are outside your individual mind, but they are mental. That there are mental processes beyond our individual minds is also a very intuitive and, I would say, established fact. So there is no counterintuitiveness, no contradiction in the hypothesis that there can be mental stuff beyond your individual mind. And the world is beyond our individual minds. So it might as well be mental stuff. That's the position of analytic idealism. The world, the universe, what exists is mental, but not your mentation, not my mentation alone, not even the mentations of all living beings put together. It's made of transpersonal mental processes out there, which present themselves to us upon observation as what we colloquially call matter. And matter is therefore a representation on our internal dashboard. We are pilots flying by instruments throughout life. The physical world is what shows up on the dials of the dashboard. But the world that is measured by the airplane's sensors, in other words, by our retinas, our eardrums, the surface of the tongue, the lining of the nose, and even the outer layer of the skin, the stuff that is measured by our sense organs is not physical. What is measured is transpersonal mental processes. And upon measurement, those transpersonal mental processes out there are represented to ourselves on our dashboard as we call the physical world around us. Physical in the colloquial sense, not the strict philosophical sense. That
channels consciousness, it doesn't produce it. The cosmos becomes sapient. From a computational perspective, super simple rules kind of suddenly give rise to very complex behavior. The cosmos appears to be assembling very complex contraptions like our brains, which are then able to channel the base consciousness. It's a participatory universe. So the participation is consciousness. Wave function collapse, and you have an observation here, and then the probabilities become something. What happens in between, there's nothing, that's like metaphysical no man's land. You have two metaphysical choices. Either it's like this cosmic nihilism, it's random, has no purpose, shut up, die, whatever, nothing's going to happen. Or you have these dogmatic, static religions which tell you exactly, very detailed, what is what and how it works. So I find these are both disillusion. I think a modern version of idealism is what we need, a scientific spirituality. So it's scientific, it means you're dealing with consensus reality and you're not denying it. And spirituality being that you are kind of open to working with your own consciousness. Everything can be decoded and has a meaning. And I believe the Western mind has totally forgotten about kind of this symbolic way of cognition.
It's almost to me as if the universe grants us mathematics, physics as a sort of to comfort us, to give us a tiny bit of control. But then the moment you go in, then you're...
That gets really into it. All right, idealism. Category number 8. So Jesse, consciousness is a fundamental reality. So idealism posits that consciousness, not matter, is the fundamental reality. Unlike physicalism, which sees consciousness as emerging from matter, idealism maintains that the physical world is either a manifestation of consciousness or exists within consciousness. So the idealist position has ancient roots in Eastern philosophy and has seen a resurgence in contemporary consciousness studies. So the modern idealists argue that consciousness cannot be explained by physical processes because it is consciousness itself that gives rise to our experience of the physical world. So, the core proposition, reality is fundamentally mental or experiential. consciousness is not a product of the physical world, but rather the ground of all existence from which the physical world arises. So here we have some variations: monistic idealism, cosmopsychism, panpsychism idealism, and so forth. And we see here that there's Eastern philosophical traditions and Indian, Buddhist, Taoist, and Western philosophical traditions. And contemporary proponents, well, we have Bernardo Kastrup, Donald Hoffman, Ian McGilchrist, Deepak Chopra, Amit Goswami, Rupert Spira, and so forth. Dear K.F. Naya, Miri Al-Bahari, sorry, I went too fast. Hitesh Shani and Junad Engineering, William Blake, and the imaginative traditions. Okay. You can read on further. It dissolves the hard problem. If consciousness is fundamental, there's no need to explain how it emerges from non-conscious matter. The explanatory gap disappears. Okay?
Look, the reason God has to die is that so superhumans can live. We have to stop projecting our own divinity and our own immortality outside of ourselves. And this is what Nietzsche was objecting to. He objected to religion not because of its extreme claims. He was saying something much more extreme, much more outrageous, frankly. He objected to religion because it made people weak.
Kripal convincingly shows in his book that many of the foundational thinkers in the humanities, like Nietzsche, Jacques Derrida, Schopenhauer, or William James, had a very open mind when it comes to metaphysics, to ontology, and that they arrived at many of their important ideas not only through scientific reasoning.
Some of the most significant individuals in the history of humanities came to their ideas through altered states. We make the mistake of thinking these people thought their way to these ideas. They did not think their way to these ideas. We have to take seriously these ideas as coming from outside the individual.
Is consciousness a byproduct of brain activity, or the mind is primary to matter? And is there reliable evidence that led you to your conclusions?
I mean, I have no idea who we're talking to here or what they might know about parapsychology. But I would say simply, to summarize that whole dimension of the subject, that in the past 150 or so years, enough evidence has accumulated from case and field studies, plus a couple of thousand experimental studies, to convince any reasonably open-minded person who takes the trouble to study it that these phenomena exist as facts of nature, period, and that our science will have to expand in some way that permits it to accommodate them. And I think you can take that to the bank.
Can you give us an example from your particular research? What are you doing to study consciousness?
Yes.
How you do it?
Yes,
what results have you achieved? What questions have you answered?
All right. Okay, so I'm working with a blind man who can perceive images in the near surroundings. So this would be like a cousin of what's called remote viewing, this alleged ability. And you always need to say alleged because people say, no, it's not true, it's not proven. Well, there's a lot of evidence and very strong protocols as to how to do that. But so I'm studying a version of that can be called extraocular vision. Other people call it mind sight. Other people call it direct vision, intuitive vision. A Frenchman 100 years ago, Jules Romain, wrote a book. He called it the paroptic sense. Whatever it is the ability to perceive visual information without your eyes.
What's the meaning of life?
To return ourselves back to the knowing of what we are. Have you ever experienced true presence, or what some people may call ecstasy of something other than yourself? It's just like you're remembering that you forgot something, you didn't know you forgot it. And sometimes we look at like the projection of the God that we follow that way. There's this like your heart opens and you feel this unity of everything. That's you remembering. So to me, that deliciousness is me remembering myself and getting to share that everyone else gets to remember too.
Taken through my pre-birth planning, I was shown that I, as a soul, had chosen my life before I ever had come to Earth. I chose my parents, I chose the family that I would be born into, I chose all of the adversity, I chose the partners that I would have my sexual, physical, and emotional traumas with, I chose the partners that I would be the in their lives. And I saw this moment as I, as a soul, made all of these decisions. And the way that it looked to me was like a video game. And so when I was picking all of these life experiences, I saw myself in a grocery store and I had this empty cart and there was a man. He was wearing a plaid blazer and a fedora. And he said, okay, pick your life. I thought, well, if I'm going to Earth, I'm going to Earth. And I started grabbing all of these. It looked like cereal boxes. And, you know, like they all said stuff on them. And so I picked to be an addict. I picked all of this major adversity and hardship. And then there was things in the cart that I hadn't experienced yet. I had picked recovery and overcoming and triumph and, you know, all of these dreams and goals. But none of that had happened in my life yet. So I begged to stay in that space. And they told me that I was a spiritual soldier. I had volunteered to come to Earth to uplift the consciousness of the planet, and that I had to go back for my mission, and that the first half of my life was just boot camp. And so I was like, I'm okay. I'm not going to finish the mission. Like, I'm just going to stay here. And they told me, no, you have to go back. And I said, no, I'm not interested in doing that. And I sort of transformed into a small child. I was like stomping my fists and my feet on the ground. And I was like, I will not go back. You guys don't tell us what Earth is actually like. It's way too challenging. It's way too difficult. There's no way that I can do it. And then I had a thought and I said, well, I definitely cannot go back into her. And I could see myself outside myself. And they said, okay, you don't have to go back into her, but you do have to go back. And so we'll show you the baby that you'll be born into. And they showed me these 3 babies. And again, everything really looked like a video game to me. And then they showed me the stats of this one baby. And this would be the baby that I would be born into. And the stats that went along with this child, they showed me her gender, her ethnicity, where she would be born, her family line, her adversity. And her life was even more challenging than my own. And I already had such a challenging life full of so much stuff. And so I threw my hands up in the air and I said, okay, I can't start from zero. I'll go back into her. And I found myself back in my awareness. And like I said, I just wrote this off as drug-induced psychosis, like spirituality, thinking of the universe, the divine, the creator. None of this was part of my life. And so I just went about my life using and I just wrote it off. And then the universe stepped in and it made itself known in this very loud, tangible way so that I had no way of mistaking that this was a real experience. There was 2 messages that were very loud and clear while I was there. One was, you have to go back to Earth. The other was, you have to stop using drugs. This is time for your mission. And so the universe started to make it possible that I could step onto my mission and, you know, like step into recovery. So all of these divine synchronicities started taking place in my life. Like all of the drug dealers that I had been dealing with for over a decade, all simultaneously decided to change their lives and stop selling drugs. People that did not know each other, so that I had no way to get drugs. And then drugs just began to not.
like almost a folder with contracts, but they were basically just agreements I had made in my soul with people before I came here. And some of them were for my benefit and some of them were for theirs. But I remember he didn't force me, but he showed me these contracts and I could see it going this way diagonally. I wouldn't say to infinity, but there was a number of contracts, hundreds and hundreds that I could see. And each one of them, the person was there, and in the middle, I was here, and we were doing something, and the contracts were so small. I remember just watching these contracts, and he explained to me that if I were to stay, which means I would have let this overdose take my life away from me permanently, I would have broken these contracts. I just remember him saying, if you don't want these contracts, it's okay. You know, basically God would understand, the universe would reroute itself to accommodate these people, but they'd have to go to, every one of them would have to have secondary or tertiary, you know, third contracts to fulfill it. So if I didn't show up at that date and that time, then someone else would have to show up the day before or the day after. And I thought to myself, I don't want to go back because I don't know what I'm supposed to do. And he said to me, sunshine, you do know, but it's not time yet. But I remember him telling me, well, how will I know what it is? And he said, you'll know because we programmed your voice. Those that need to find you will find you because of your voice. I didn't have any awareness of my body anymore. The I part of me wasn't there. I was still myself, but I was my expanded self. I was who I was, but at any time I could reach out and it's like I could merge with whoever or whatever. I remember that I made my decision not for myself. That was one thing I do remember, is it was my decision to come back, but I had done it based on the idea that what I had to offer was of value to the people around me, and that I had known these people. I didn't know how, but I had made a contract. What a small, seems like insignificant thing, but to know that our souls are so mapped out. Not that we can't choose it, we absolutely do choose it, but that there's so much time and energy, there's so much care and thought that goes into our pre-planning of our life, the blueprints. I didn't have the life review like other people do. I didn't see my whole life flash before my eyes. No.
My purpose here was to help people remember who they are, wake up and remember who they are as these light beings in themselves that I saw in the eyes of my friend and that I see in every single person I meet through their eyes, this bright lightness that they are, to remember that in themselves and to find their way back home to the truth of who they are. That this existence isn't all there is, that loving presence is the truth. So the journaling really helped me connect with the council and go through this period of time where I was really depressed and not sure how to even do this purpose and how to find my way. You know, I went into working thinking nursing was the route, and then that wasn't really right. And then I went into thinking maybe psychology was the route, but then that didn't really feel right. And then lo and behold, out of a bunch of chance serendipitous happenings, I met a massage therapist, and she offered to teach my partner at the time and I some massage techniques. When I met her, we had a really nice connection. So the second time I met her, I said, you know what? Why am I so miserable? I have this, everything I'm supposed to want, right? We're supposed to want to have a car. We're supposed to want to further our lives in college. We're supposed to have a partner, and we're supposed to have housing. I've got all that and I'm miserable. Why? And she said, maybe you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. And I said, what am I supposed to be doing? And she said, well, maybe you should go check out this massage school. I was open to whatever. And I walked into the massage school, and the moment I walked in, something just opened in me and said, this is it. This is where you're supposed to be going. And so I began massage school, and I graduated massage school in about 2 years. While I would be working with people, information just would come in. I would just know things about them. I would just know what was sticking in their lives, or know what needed to shift or change, or notice the perspective shift they needed, or something. And I didn't understand it. It just sort of downloaded. And sometimes they would be so insistent in my head that I would just have to say something, almost embarrassed to, because it's kind of out of the blue. So after a while, that's what people came for. I never talked about it. I mostly holed up around it because I was used to people not believing what I had been through on the paranormal side of it all, on the mystical side of it all. People could understand the miraculous physical healing, but they couldn't take in the mystical counsel part. So I just journaled as my support system at night, and then did my work in the office. And more, I would just know what people were needing. Not always, I couldn't master and make it happen. It just spontaneously happened. And then people would come more and more for that. And then at some point, the council told me, it's time for you to meet your husband's spiritual teacher, who happened to live in Santa Cruz. So through a bunch of serendipity and divine alignment, my husband and I, my family, all moved to Santa Cruz, California, and began my journey of opening up about this near-death experience. I ended up meeting Raymond Moody, who wrote the first book about NDEs called Life After Life, and we began a project here that was in aspiration of bringing NDE to the mainstream, and began speaking at International Association of Near-Death Studies groups, and started my practice here in California, where I still practice. And in moving to California, I learned that I needed to be more open about this whole mystical part of my near-death experience and really talking about it. And so moving to California was the first time that I spoke openly about it. And since then, I've spoken quite a bit and done several podcasts. And it began the first time that I started really opening and revealing and really diving into this more mystical side of what had happened to me. Really what's being called to do now is to help people integrate those experiences. So we're awake, and now we come back to this contraction, and I don't want people to have to go through what I went through with the contraction and have to try to find their way, 30 years of finding their way through it all here like I did. So now my business is shifting to offering people how you can integrate this and helping you integrate into bringing those insights and that reality that you know is truth into this world today.
There are just two more cases that I won't go into detail on, but they're also very strong. One is the case that I actually also published with Dr. Bettina Payton, who had cardiac arrest during a cesarean section for the birth of her third child. And once again, she had her eyes taped shut. And yet at a certain point, she, of course, hears the surgeon say, basically, well, no, it's the anesthesiologist say her blood pressure is too low. How far along are you in the surgery to the surgeon? And he basically says her blood pressure is plummeting fast. And at that point, she hears a loud expletive because, in fact, her blood pressure has plummeted. And they then go ahead and press that red button to call a code into the wall because her heart has stopped. And she then is watching all of this now from above her body in the operating room, seeing everything in the operating room. She then leaves for a period of time and goes, she says, she realizes it's not another realm. It's another state of consciousness that she is in, where she feels one with this sparkling like intelligence. And she feels totally happy there, but then is told, you have to go back. She goes back, enters the operating room, and sees the code team rushing into the room, trying to revive her. And then this white-haired surgeon coming in, weaving his way through the room to her side, taking his hand, reaching into her blood-filled abdomen, locating the aorta, clamping his finger around it, clamping it shut, and that's when her heart stops pumping again. And she knows that she's going to live because she's watching all of this happening. And she then, again, hears a nurse whisper in her ear that you have a baby that's a beautiful little girl, she survived. She wakes up in the recovery room later from the anesthesia, and before anybody can talk to her, even though she has a trachea tube in her mouth still, she motions for them to say nothing and for a napkin, and she writes on the napkin, I know my heart stopped. I know my uterus is out because they did a hysterectomy, and I know I have a baby girl, so that she could tell them before they could tell her exactly what happened. And she said from that moment, she knew that consciousness was fundamental, that she was not just this physical body. And she had been an atheist ahead of time, but that experience now told her I'm much more than my five senses and the neurons in my brain.
And then there is this thing called altered states. Okay. Altered states of consciousness represent temporary changes in the typical patterns of subjective experience. And these states provide unique windows into the nature of consciousness by revealing its flexibility, constraints, and potential transformations. So from ancient shamanic practices to modern neuroscience labs, humans have explored altered states of consciousness to understand consciousness, healing, and reality itself. And these states challenge our assumptions about ordinary waking consciousness and suggest that our typical experience represents just one point in a vast spectrum of possible conscious state. So the core proposition here is studying consciousness through its alterations reveals mechanisms and properties that remain hidden during ordinary states. So altered states of consciousness serve as natural experiments that help us understand the relationship between brain activity, subjective experience, and reality. So here we go. Meditation, psychedelic states, psilocybin, LSD, dimethyltryptamine, DMT, and so forth. Near-death experiences, hypnagogic and hypnopompic states, flow state, mystical experiences. Read up about it. Key researchers and theorists. Henry Bergson, Carl Jung, Charles Todd, Dean Radin, Brian Josephson, Ken Wilber, Alan Combs, Jonathan Schooler, Rupert Sheldrake, Jacobo Greenberg, Zilberbaum, Thomas Campbell, Brian Swimmer, Christopher Lungman. Yeah. So here we go into near-death experiences, DOPS, meditation research, psychedelic research. Amazing. What is it like to be a bat? Thomas Nagel argues that consciousness is inherently subjective, meaning that no matter how much objective science we have, we can never fully know what it is like to experience the world from another being's perspective.
You are really famous for. What is the bat article? What is it like to be a bat about?
Well, it's an article in what came to be another of my major interests, the philosophy of mind. It isn't really about bats, although the example of the bat plays an important part in it. It is an article whose real subject is the so-called mind-body problem, namely, what is the relation in reality between mental events like seeing and hearing and the brain events that they seem to be closely associated with. In that article, I was arguing against the, at that time, common and still fairly common view that mental events could be completely identified with some neurophysiological events, that they really were part of the physical world, and that a complete description of them could be given in physical terms. My claim in that article, which I still believe, is that there is an irreducibly subjective aspect to conscious mental states, like feeling pain or tasting chocolate or seeing the color red, that can't be analyzed in physical terms. And to persuade people of this, I asked them to think about bats and their very distinctive sensory capacity of echolocation, which we do not share, and asked them to think, when you think about what it's like for the bat to navigate through echolocation, there is a limit to what you can grasp about this. You can perhaps learn a great deal about the kinds of features that the bat can detect by echolocation. You can learn a great deal about the underlying physiology that makes it possible, but you won't know what it's like for the bat to do this, because you can't imagine a sense that you don't have. It's being tied to a particular type of point of view, which bats have, but we don't have. And the general point was that all of experience is subjective in the sense of being tied to the particular type of point of view of the sorts of creatures that can have that experience.
Nature speak to us in a language that we don't fully hear anymore.
Yes.
This video is about biosemiotics, a new way to understand non-human consciousness in nature.
What you saw was the elephants on the coastal zones. They broke free from their shackles and they headed for the hills, and the people followed them.
Before the tsunami, this is, of course, yeah.
Hours before the tsunami. No human and none of our artifacts of measurement knew what was going on, but they knew. Our mind is in the world. Our mind is emergent through the relations we have with all the other beings and all the other strands. Every organism sees a different part of reality.
Yeah, has a different dashboard.
Yeah. And insofar as we can become aware of any other organism, we are sharing some sort of umwelt. There's some overlap. You're killing ways of seeing the world, ways of being in the world. You know, when we destroy olive trees that have been around for 1,000 years, we don't know what relations those olive trees were holding up on an ecological level, but also on a semiotic one. When we are scrolling through our black mirrors, you know, looking for that dopamine release, what we're actually craving is to be nestled in the branches or the roots of a tree. In Japan, they have Shinrin-yoku, forest bathing, where doctors prescribe for various illnesses, go be in a forest, lie down, breathe, be there for an hour, feel all your emotions.
We need to feel again, you said.
That's the only way that we will survive.
On the topic of semiotics, I want to read out this article. It's written by Françoise Melby Anthony, and will take about 5 minutes. And I found this in 2026, although the story goes back to 2012. So the headline says, "An elephant herd honors the man who gave them a home." All right. 2 days after Lawrence Anthony, the man known as the Elephant Whisperer, died, the 21 elephants to whom he'd given safe haven came to say goodbye. And this is Françoise speaking. "I can still hear them, the rumbling that vibrated through the reserve that dry evening in March. Their grief-filled moans, the agitated movements of their ears, those big eyes fixed on me and me alone. My husband Lawrence always said there were things in this world that cannot be explained by reason, cannot be seen. deep roots that connect all living things, humans and animals. It wasn't until that night, 2 days after Lawrence died, that I truly understood. This was a man who'd somehow charmed me into leaving my native France for an old Dutch farmhouse out on the savannah of Zululand in South Africa. A man who suddenly suggested we buy an old game reserve and transform it into Thula Thula, a lodge in an animal haven where leopards, zebras and wild rhinos could roam free. A man who, after watching a news report on the Iraq War, sneaked into Baghdad in the midst of battle to rescue trapped zoo animals. And then, of course, there were the elephants. Everyone called Lawrence the Elephant Whisperer. He earned the nickname after adopting a herd of 9 delinquent elephants about to be put to death. The herd was prone to escaping its protected habitat and rampaging through populated areas. Dangerous. Lawrence's mind was made up though. Maybe the elephants kept wandering because they were not in the right home, he said. He had no knowledge of wild African elephants, yet night after night he camped out with them to earn their trust, a move that almost got him trampled. He sang to them, talked to them. Crazy, people said, but little by little the herd took him in. First the matriarch, Nana, then the rest. They forged a deep bond, one based on trust and respect. The elephants stopped escaping and made Thula Thula their home. Sometimes they tagged along with Lawrence on his visits to the elephants deep in the bush. Nana would extend her trunk to him and caress his face as if he were a member of the family. The herd increased to 21 elephants and our property doubled over the years, but the bond remained, and so did Lawrence's nickname, though he preferred to be called the Elephant Listener. I don't have a special talent, he told me. The elephants talk to me if they want to, and if they don't want to, I don't insist. I just listen. I only wished he'd listen to me every now and then. Lawrence was physically strong, a robust 6'3", but lately he'd been having heart trouble. In September, at the age of 61, he suffered his second heart attack. He wasn't supposed to fly, but he had insisted on travelling to Joburg for a week-long business trip to help advance the mission of Thula Thula. "Françoise, I'll be fine," he said before he left. "There's no need to fret." The call came at 7 o'clock in the morning on Friday, March the 2nd, 2012. I was awake early, straightening up the house in preparation for Lawrence's return. On the phone was David, Lawrence's right-hand man, sobbing. I could only snippet. Lawrence, unconscious, heart attack. "I'm so sorry, Françoise," he said. "He's gone." I clutched the phone. "Impossible, impossible," I whispered. But deep down I knew it was true. The news hit Thula Thula like a bomb. Our staff of 70 was inconsolable. Lawrence wasn't just the boss. His Zulu name was Mukulu, or grandfather. That's how everyone saw him. I knew they needed me to be strong to assure them that we'd be okay, even without Lawrence. But I couldn't think, I couldn't speak. My head was lost in memories. Like the first time we'd met, waiting for a taxi in London, where we had both gone on business. It was freezing, a mix of rain and snow, and I finally made it to the front of the line. The concierge asked if I'd mind sharing a ride with the men at the back, also headed to the convention center. Lawrence was wearing a bright blue windbreaker in the middle of January, as if he were on safari. "No way was I sharing a ride with that guy. No, I said. To my great surprise, I ran into him later at a tube station. It was hard to miss that windbreaker. This time I introduced myself, apologized for my rudeness, and it was one of those moments orchestrated by that invisible force Lawrence believed in. We met for dinner and a jazz show, and 1 year later I left Paris, headed for South Africa. It was easy to face the unknown with Lawrence. He made me feel less fearful. I didn't want to face the unknown without him. Didn't want to live in a world without his fierce spirit and generosity. Life without Lawrence. Impossible, impossible. So 2 days after Lauren's death, Sunday, I was still holed up in our bedroom. People passed in and out of the house, paying their respects. It made no difference to me. "They're here," someone said with a gasp. Who was here? The voice was followed by shouts, all kinds of commotion. What was going on? I dragged myself downstairs and opened the front door. The staff was gathered outside, all staring in the same directions, eyes wide. On the other side of the fence, on our property, were 21 distinct grey shapes. The elephants. Lawrence's elephants. Nana gazed at me, and so did the rest. As if they were waiting for something or someone. They remained like that for more than an hour. They marched up and down along the fence, rumbling, the same noise they'd always used to talk with Lawrence. They seemed edgy, distressed. Finally they lined up one by one and made their solemn procession back into the bush. The work at Thulla Thulla continues, as my husband would have wanted it. Most people have moved on, but an elephant never forgets. The year after Lauren's death, on March the 4th, the elephants returned, led by Nana in the same procession. The year after that, again, on March 4th, they were back. And again on March 4th, the following year, they mourned him like one of their herd. How did they know? Who sent them? What does it mean? Some things in this world are beyond human understanding, cannot be explained by reason, cannot be seen.
The brain clearly is able to receive and emit electromagnetic fields. When you have perturbations of Earth's magnetic field, we tend to see more psychiatric hospital admissions during those periods. Second, people who are in the hospital who have epilepsy, who are being monitored, those individuals tend to have more seizures during periods of increased geomagnetic activity. There's something here that's happening.
Dr. Nicholas Rouleau is a neuroscientist and bioengineer at Wilfrid Laurier University who is doing exciting research on the relationship between electromagnetic fields and living systems.
There's an information source that isn't genetic, and bioelectromagnetism simply placed that instructive information outside of the system itself.
Rouleau is a close collaborator of Michael Levin, whose lab work on bioelectricity suggests a platonic realm of form that shapes life at the cellular level. Rouleau is researching this hypothesis at the level of brains. You've done experiments where you shield off brains, right, from electromagnetic fields to see what happens.
People do have odd experiences in Faraday cages. This can range from feeling really, really calm to, having the odd experience of like feeling uneasy and things like this. And that's just from being in the chamber. Look at how the brain functions. If it's a productive organ, it cannot have the survival of consciousness. If it is a transmissive organ, that opens up the possibility that it could exist after death.
In an award-winning essay, Rouleau argues how his research on electromagnetism points to the plausibility of William James' theory that our brain filters consciousness.
Ironically, I think that the ancient view of death is more accurate than the modern medical view. The modern medical view is that there's a moment of death. There is no moment of death.
Explain sort of this influence of magnetic fields on my brain and how exactly do they influence my brain and what do we know empirically?
Sure. Yeah. I think the easiest way to digest this is actually to start with non-human animals first. It's always easier to imagine that species and systems other than ourselves are influenced by environmental variables. And so we've known for a very long time that insects and birds, for example, fish, are highly responsive to electromagnetic environmental energies. And what I mean by that is, for example, if you look at how birds navigate in 3D space, even at night when they're not getting visual feedback, They navigate according to Earth's magnetic field. And when Earth's magnetic field is perturbed, for example, when the sun gives off coronal mass ejections, people may have experienced this directly visually by looking at, for example, the aurora borealis. When you see the aurora borealis, what you're looking at is basically particles from the sun have moved towards the Earth and are trapped in Earth's magnetic field around the poles. And that dancing light that you see is a visual indication that Earth's magnetic field is being perturbed. Well, for the birds, what that means is their internal compasses that allow them to navigate in 3D space have been completely disturbed, jammed, and they're unable to navigate using those same systems. The same thing for bumblebees and other kinds of insects. Swarming behavior changes in insects. Fish won't navigate the same way. Now, if you move to humans, you'll find that there's all sorts of interesting phenomena that have been reported over the past 100 years that are relevant to Earth's magnetic field for humans. So, for example, when you have perturbations of Earth's magnetic field, humans, we tend to see more psychiatric hospital admissions during those periods, first of all. Second, among inpatients with epilepsy, people who are in the hospital who have epilepsy, who are being monitored, those individuals tend to have more seizures during periods of increased geomagnetic activity. And so there clearly is an effect on the brain of humans as well as other species in terms of when Earth's magnetic field is perturbed. But it turns out there's also effects on these brains when Earth's magnetic field is quiet, and we could talk about those if you like, but I always like pointing to these perturbational moments, because what it gives you is an experimental tool to look at quiet periods versus non-quiet periods or stormy periods and really distinguish, differences in behavior. And from the behavioral and cognitive sciences perspective, that's the relevant level of analysis. Is the animal changing the way that it navigates in the world based upon these environmental perturbations?
Yeah, so you say it's a perturbation, for instance, like if something happens in the electromagnetic field of the Earth. So the first question I have, like a bit skeptic. So these are statistically significant results, and it's replicated, and we know this. It's we can put the papers down in our description, and this is like hardcore science.
Definitely. Yeah. And it's been replicated multiple times in the laboratory, but also just in naturalistic settings. So, for example, the study that I cited about increased rates of epilepsy or epileptic seizures among those with epilepsy, that was replicated, in the early 20th century. And then in the later 20th century, you saw totally different data sets being used, but a replication of the phenomenon. Yeah. And that is correlative data. So you're really looking at, whether geomagnetic activity is perturbed or not, and you can't control that. The sun controls that, right? But you can see you can see frequencies go up and down. And then if you go to the laboratory, you realize that you can actually perturb the temporal lobes with electromagnetic fields. By directly applying electromagnetic fields to the brain, you can change brain activity. And so it's an independent verification that the mechanism is valid. Yeah, we know from many studies that, for example, the dreaming state is clearly affected by geomagnetic activity. So not only does the amount of REM that you experience, rapid eye movement associated with dreaming, not only does that amount of REM sleep change as a function of geomagnetic conditions, but it also changes based upon your orientation of the way that you sleep, which is related to how the flux lines interact with your body. Also, people will have really interesting kinds of dreams during periods of geomagnetic disturbance, either really quiet periods or really disturbed periods. Those dreams include premonitions. This is the experience of the future before it happens, right? So whether or not you think people are actually glimpsing the future, the fact that the next day they report having had a premonition type experience, and those types of experiences, which just empirically exist, people report these things, those types of experiences are happening and they're coinciding with these periods of geomagnetic change, that gives you an indication that there's something here that's happening. And then what you ought to do is go to the laboratory and actually test the hypothesis by simulating geomagnetic conditions or shielding it in the laboratory context.
We might even be noticing 1% of all the minds that there are, namely sort of the brain or brain-focused, nervous-focused view of looking at consciousness, which was to me like, whoa, if this is true, that's just like extraordinary idea, right? That 99%, we're missing out on 99% of minds. Could you please explain your work and this view you have with Michael Levin?
Sure, yeah. Well, we originally explored the idea that mind is multiply realizable, that you can realize a mind using different substrates and different mechanisms. And when I say mind, I mean more than just consciousness. I just mean the whole category of cognition. Generally in psychology, you can think of things as being either cognitive or behavioral. Cognitive are things that are associated with internal states, experiences, thoughts and feelings. Behavioral is all the stuff that you can observe. And what we were really interested in was whether a mind could be realized by different kinds of systems. And, if you start with something like learning, we already accept that learning is something that can be implemented by machines. We explicitly call it learning, right? Machine learning. And even though it's implemented by different hardware and there may be different algorithms fundamentally that are achieving the learning, we know that learning is something that is completely substrate independent. Different organisms can do it. Plants can do it just as well as mammals. Single cells can do it. Machines can do it. Materials can do it. We know that you can condition iron bars. We know that different kinds of silver nanowire networks, if you run electrical current through them, they rearrange themselves into precise networks that are highly efficient. And you might say, well, what does that have anything to do with learning? The point is you have to have operational definitions for these things. That's a kind of behaviorist approach. If you have an operational definition, which in the case of learning might be something like outputs that are contingent upon a history of inputs. Does your next move change based upon what happened before? That speaks to learning. It speaks to memory, which are of course related. And if you start with something like that, you realize, well, at least that property of minds is substrate independent. Then you get to things like decision-making, attention, problem solving, all these easy problems, right? And you can find similar analogies in the world. And then you get to consciousness, and it's kind of, almost a dead end because we're limited by the ways that we measure consciousness. We don't have a direct measure. We only have indirect measures. And then we have theories of consciousness, which Mike and I argue are really our tools to escape what we call mind blindness. We are blind to what might be many, many minds in the world, whether they be conscious or not. We are blind to them precisely because we don't have good models of how minds work. And I think a great example for this that really hits home is plants. Plants are incredibly intelligent systems. They don't share our nervous systems. They don't have the same cells. They use these vascular networks, although they do use certain kinds of chemicals that are similar to our brains, like the most common neurotransmitter in the brain that's excitatory is called glutamate. Plants use glutamate as well for signaling, so there's some commonality there. But plants have totally different structures, and yet they can achieve all sorts of interesting functions. They can anticipate where the sun will be the night before the sun rises. Like at night, they can turn their leaves toward where the sun will rise the next day. They can engage in game theoretic decision-making, which takes into consideration their neighbors in terms of kin versus non-kin. Like, is that plant like me? Does it share my genes or not? And should I compete for resources with it or not? Right? It does all sorts of intelligent things. And in fact, when you look at plants on cameras that change the time scale, right? What you find is this incredibly dynamic thing that's happening with plants. They're orienting their leaves, they're moving around and swaying. If you saw those same kinds of behaviors in real time, you might be tempted to say that that thing is alive and animate and thinking. But because it's happening at a totally different time scale, we just don't consider that. And that speaks to our mind blindness. Our intuitions are grounded in, we need something that looks kind of like an ape, that moves around and speaks and has facial expressions and can respond to a name. We have something like this that defines our intuitions about what has minds, but we think it goes so much deeper. There are better ways to identify minds in the world.
I'm fascinated by the idea proposed by Dr. Persinger, with whom you worked and under whom you graduated, right? That he proposed, and this is like pretty out there idea, that the Earth's magnetic field could store basically all of conscious experience. I mean, let's say it from like a more safe physics perspective, there's a notion of Einstein's block universe, like basically everything that can happen is stored in, and somehow we're moving through that. And now we're touching upon what time is and the flow of time. We get into sort of like these deep puzzles in physics. But it's just to say that if every lifeline, every conscious experience that has ever happened and can ever happen needs to be stored somewhere, he proposed that it had something, could have something to do with that magnetic field of the Earth, which sounds to me like a science fiction, quite a science fiction idea, but you take up on that idea in your essay. So I'm just curious, sort of, isn't that stretching physics to its extreme, or what are the calculations here? Say just for the plot of this sci-fi movie, that field indeed could store every conscious experience. How would it do so? And would it mean that we can download that information when new life? Because that's what we're talking about, right?
Yeah. I think that this has not yet been demonstrated experimentally. What Dr. Persinger put forward were some calculations showing energy equivalences, where he could show that basically if you take the energy associated with an action potential, that's like 10 to the minus 20th joules.
Yeah.
You multiply that over the number of cycles per second and the average neuron is firing, so like 10 hertz. And then you multiply that over the number of neurons in the brain. And then you multiply that over the number of brains on Earth and those that have ever existed. And you can get an idea of the amount of energy that's involved with a thought, with thoughts over a lifetime, with memories, with the entire memory of the human species. You can get these rough estimates of, what thought looks like in terms of energy. And that energy can be stored in Earth's magnetic field, just in terms of energy equivalence. It doesn't get at the mechanism of stability. Can the experience encoded in electromagnetic fields emitted by the brain, can that actually be stored in an electromagnetic field and remain stable such that it could be reaccessed or transmitted to another brain? That hasn't been demonstrated at all. I'm not aware of anything that shows that you can get this stable effect. It could be that the information is not stored in the electromagnetic field, but rather is stored locally in matter. Matter is much more stable. And if you can encode those patterns into matter, then they can remain, let's say, in resonance with an external system. So, for example, you can have, if you take the brain, you take our brain, for example, you have all these incredible synaptic patterns. They have an electromagnetic equivalent. Those electromagnetic signals are being emitted and are interacting with Earth's magnetic field. Humans are doing this en masse. For example, you have half of the planet awake at one time, half the planet asleep at one time, right? That's a lot of people with very similar brain rhythms at the same time. Okay, so you have all this happening, but are those rhythms actually being stored in Earth's magnetic field? It could be that what's happening is they're influencing Earth's magnetic field. Earth's magnetic field is in turn encoding information into the brains themselves. And this accounts for all sorts of experiences that people have reported, like shared dreams and the zeitgeist phenomenon, right? And the idea of, two people in separate places having some kind of link between them suddenly. It's not that the information is out there. It's that the information is being shared in a common medium. Experimentally, we don't have the answers to this, but, it is something that should be looked at. There are all sorts of experiences that people have reported throughout history, not just now, but in centuries past, that are better explained by a transmissive model. One of them is, memories of a past life, or the experience of sharing thoughts, especially in times of crisis. In fact, the person who invented EEG, Hans Berger, the only reason he invented EEG was to specifically look for that signal. He invented EEG specifically because his when he was a young man in the army, he had a near-death experience where basically the wheel of some machine almost crushed his head, and at that exact time, 200 miles away, his sister had this experience of worry and sort of existential dread, and she wrote a telegram that was time-stamped, and Hans Berger eventually realized that, she had this experience at the same time that I was about to die. And so he didn't think it was a coincidence. He thought there must be some connection between us that could be explained. And so he spent his life looking for a signal that could be emitted by the brain and received by the brain. And what he found was the electric fields of the brain. Now, we still use EEG all the time to infer brain states, but we forgot about that story. That story is no longer part of the canon of how, neuroscience developed in terms of neuroimaging. But it remains true that the only reason why he found that was he was looking for some kind of signal that could connect brains.
Am I now also connecting with you electromagnetically in a sense?
Yeah, I mean, the way that, so when you look at like a textbook and you look at the, how electromagnetic fields are represented in 2 dimensions, you see these like flux lines. Well, those flux lines, they go out forever, but the intensity of the field diminishes as a square of the distance. So you get this, as you move out by
a good closure.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's it. So I think that actually is a relevant point here. So
yeah,
when you're further away from someone, I mean, unless there's some intermediate connective force, the connection between us is very low. But for people who are sleeping beside each other, or for the developing fetus, for example, for systems that are very close to one another, there could be some interesting overlap that simply isn't tested because under the productive model, it just doesn't make sense to even hypothesize that these connections might exist. Under a transmissive model, or in consideration of some kind of transmissive function, it makes much more sense to even hypothesize that there might be a connection between brains. I see tremendous beauty in the world. And as I get older, I see more and more beauty. Especially as you gain knowledge about the world, you just see it in different layers and textures, and you see interactions that you weren't aware of before. So you can see it constantly with new eyes, which is part of the fun. To me, there's nothing more interesting than thinking about how all of these things interact with each other. Looking at the cycles of life and how there are very blurry boundaries between the self and the non-self. We have these very rigid words that draw very clear distinctions between the outside world and the inside world. And nature just doesn't work like that. That's how language works. Language has discrete labels to describe a world, but nature is continuous fundamentally. And, just as there is a continuity of the electromagnetic spectrum from light to radio waves and so on, there's a continuity between the air and my skin, and the pressure of the atmosphere is pushing against my skin. If we had a different pressure, I would be shaped differently. You can't forget that you are a product of the environment, and the environment is a product of you. You are the environment to it. And so even those words that I'm using right now are sort of a vestige of a time where we thought these things were totally separate. I think that it's all very much integrated, and we have to think about how to describe the world in ways that is much more about an exchange rather than one thing acting on another. If you look at things like learning, or memory. I think memory is a great example of something that we can look at through just this beautiful lens of interaction between an environment and a person. So what is it fundamentally? You are holding on to a trace of the world. You're holding on to not the world. It's not the thing. It is a representation of the thing that you hold on to, an incomplete parcel of information representative of something that did happen in a real space, in a real time. But now it's translocated and not at all the same thing. That memory really does exist. It's there. And you have changed the world by placing it there. The world has copied itself imperfectly into another space. I have a representation of my child in my head right now. I can think about her and certain synapses are lighting up, but those synapses are in a pattern that is representative of her. She has a place physically in a space that isn't her. And that's incredible. What a wonder to be able to physically alter the world simply by being. And once you understand that that's what's happening all around us with all features of the environment, with the atmosphere, with the electromagnetic environment, with other people, and you realize that there's this constant sharing of information, it becomes a beautiful thing. It's almost spiritual, I would say. Yeah.
Category 10, challenges to consciousness, philosophical and scientific critiques. So despite decades of research and theorizing, consciousness remains one of the most challenging phenomena to explain. So various thinkers have identified fundamental problems with existing approaches, questioning whether we can ever fully understand subjective experience through objective methods. Okay. The hard problem, articulated by David Chalmers but anticipated by many earlier thinkers, represents just one of several profound challenges, from cognitive limitations to conceptual paradoxes. This critique forces us to reconsider our basic assumptions about mind, matter, and the nature of explanation itself. So the core proposition here is the challenges to understanding consciousness may be fundamental rather than temporary, pointing to limitations in our cognitive capacities, conceptual frameworks, or scientific methods. Yeah, so here we go. Major categories: the explanatory gap, cognitive closure. Some problems may be beyond our cognitive capacities, just that quantum mechanics is beyond the dog's understanding, while it's beyond my understanding. The free will problem, reductionist limitations, the measurement problem, conceptual confusions. Alright, and here's some key thinkers: Thomas Nagel, Colin McGinn, Sam Harris, David Eagleman, Raymond Tullis, Eugene Nakazawa, George Musser, Paul Davis. Okay. Yeah, it's lots more information. Let's recap for a moment. So I don't, of course, know about your reflections, your journaling outcomes, your mind mapping. So I leave it up to you. But to give you my vision of things, so I believe we deal with different levels. So if you look at the level of planet Earth, and like I said, I feel like it's a capsule. When you're in that capsule with the experience of being human and or a plant or an animal on planet Earth, there is certain laws and physics and consistencies, but they happen inside that capsule. And like I said, it's between the crust of the Earth and seemingly about 10,000 kilometers before we're in outer space. So we're dealing then with an experience of a controlled hallucination where we have a sense of self, but in reality, there is never ever such a self. It's a very cleverly created, controlled hallucination. Whether that's purely of the brain, whether that's the brain channeling, who is to say? Whether it comes completely from outside the brain and the brain is not part of it. I doubt that. So I definitely think there's a place of the brain when it comes to consciousness. But I also see it's like consciousness is not purely of the brain and there is no death. Now, I've realized also that all time goes on all the time and all time already is, but time is plastic. So the future can be changed now by increasing the number of possibilities you have, both intellectually but also emotionally. I also feel that although we're in this capsule where we feel like this is my body, this is where I stop, and then there's the outside world, we're totally connected, interconnected, even with the molecules in the air. Without all of these molecules that weigh 10,000 kilos pressing down on me, I wouldn't be able to keep this body in place. There's an internal pressure that's equal with the external pressure of the air, and that sort of keeps the possibility of this body or the plant or everything else. Then we're really learning about the influence of electromagnetic fields. Well, we know they can be loaded with lots of information. Yeah, satellites can send me electromagnetic rays and movies, sound, whatever, can just be transcoded and be delivered to me. Does that mean, oh, we can now make an analogy, that's how our brain works? Well, no, but it's an interesting notion that the geomagnetic fields do influence the frequency of epileptic seizures, about people going off the moon sickness, mildly lunar. Well, psychotic admissions are higher when there's, for example, an aurora borealis or an aurora australis. So, yeah, I won't go into all of it because I've got other videos done about that. But then there is a borderland, which is not part of this capsule. In this borderland, you keep this kind of individualism, the characteristics, etc., as you would have had in your embodiment on planet Earth. But the mind is extremely more powerful, so we're told. So one thought of a desire, I will something, and there it is. So in a lot of spiritual teaching says, God, will there be light? So yeah, at that level, will is extremely powerful. If I say like, I will $1 million in my bank account, didn't happen. I will a Ferrari or Lamborghini or Maserati, all three of them in my garage. Not that my garage is big enough, it holds one car. It doesn't happen. I will that I experience at one with God. No, I will to be enlightened and will to have that holy instant. It doesn't happen. But in the astral realm, that is reality. So we're told. So we're all powerful, we're still individuals, and there's many dwelling places. It's a borderland. And then we have a level, well, assumedly, it's a perfect singularity, perfect oneness, creative source, your authentic self, my authentic self. Can we be in the full knowledge of that authentic self and walk on planet Earth? Well, the design seems to be, with all the evidence, no. You cannot be in two worlds. You cannot be in two worlds or the borderland. You can get glimpses of it. Some people like Paramahansa Yogananda. He said he wasn't in a full realization of it. Well, if we read the stories of Jesus, he seems to be quite in that level of experience while still being here. But to be completely in a state of singularity. Maybe the enlightened ones say that, yeah, they're in a continuous conscious contact with God, creation, singularity, consciousness. But there rather is a few than many, so it seems. Although there might be many, and they might just be keep quiet and live somewhere in the jungle that we don't know of. So yes, so since you and I are talking at the level of Earth, I want to go into some practicalities of life on planet Earth, but also with the idea this can be very helpful on the quest of solving my problem, and hopefully it will be helpful to you as well. So I want to start with the work of a neuroscientist, Stringy, and Lukov, and we'll start there and see where we end
What's
up.
the problem with people obsessing over finding their purpose, in your opinion?
It makes them miserable. When we try to find our purpose, we feel like if we haven't found it yet, something is wrong with our life. Our life doesn't have meaning. We also spend a lot of time comparing our life to the life of others. We wonder, why is it that this person seems like she knows where she's going? Why is this person so excited about what they're doing? Why do they have a passion? Why is it that I don't have my purpose? I don't have my passion. And because of that, we become so obsessed with figuring out what is my purpose that we end up not giving ourselves the time and the possibility to explore and maybe figuring out in the end what that is.
What is a better way to look at creating a direction in life then?
A better way to figuring out your purpose is just to experiment. It's thinking like a scientist. When a scientist wants to learn something new, they don't start with a specific outcome in mind. What they do is that they start with a research question, a hypothesis. They wonder, hey, what might happen if I tried this? If you do that, if you keep on asking questions, if you keep on trying new things, if you keep on making mistakes, learning from them, and iterating, this is how you figure out your purpose.
Why should we commit to curiosity?
In essence, committing to curiosity is ensuring that you're going to live a life that is intentional, that you're going to live your life, not the life that other people are expecting you to live. Curiosity keeps you adaptable and nimble in an ever-changing world. It ensures that you stay open to new possibilities, and frankly, it just makes life more fun. This all might sound philosophical, but there's actually a lot of neuroscientific research showing that when we experience thirst for water, the same parts of the brain activate than when we experience thirst for information. So when we say, I'm thirsty for knowledge, I want to learn more, I want to know more, we couldn't be more right. And thinking about your own mindsets, developing this self-awareness is really just a way to direct this curiosity towards the things that you actually want to do. There is an alternative to those three mindsets, which is called the experimental mindset. This is a mindset where your curiosity and your ambition are both high. In an experimental mindset, you're open to uncertainty. You see it as an opportunity to explore, to grow, and to learn. Having an experimental mindset helps us completely reimagine our relationship to ambition and to goals. When you have an experimental mindset, instead of chasing those linear goals that give you the illusion of certainty, you're open to designing experiments. Instead of trying to get to a specific outcome, you start from a research question. Anytime you don't understand something, it doesn't create fear, it creates curiosity. Having an experimental mindset means seeing failures as data points that you can learn from. It means being open to making mistakes because you know you're going to learn from them. It means embracing the fact that you might not have a plan, that you don't know what's coming. And this is great. It means that you can design your life in a way that is conscious and connected. The idea of cultivating an experimental mindset is based on the scientific method. And this is very simple. First, you start by observing your current situation, by looking at the world around you. Then you ask a research question, and you design a tiny experiment to collect data, which you can then analyze. Based on those results, you can decide what your next step is. What's great about that is that even though you don't know where you're going, you can trust that you're going to grow through each cycle of experimentation. To design an experiment, you need to commit to curiosity. A great way to do this is to design what I call a pact. This is a commitment device where you say, I am going to run this experiment. The way it works is that you choose one action and you then decide on a duration. And you say, I will perform this action for this specific duration. Why does it look like that? There are several reasons. The first one is that when a scientist designs an experiment, they design in advance on the number of trials. You don't simply stop in the middle if the results don't really look like what you expected. You collect all of the data. And once you have all of that data, you can analyze it and decide what the answer is. The second reason is that it allows you to notice when you're falling prey to the maximalist brain. You can make sure that you're keeping your experiment tiny enough that you're actually going to complete it by choosing a duration that is reasonable, something you can actually achieve so you can collect all of the necessary data. A pact is purposeful. It needs to be something you care about. And what's great is that when each pact you design has purpose imbued into it, you don't need to have a grand purpose in life. A pact is actionable. This is something that you need to be able to do right now. You don't need extra resources. You don't need help from other people. This uncertainty fuels anxiety. Research shows that when we experience uncertainty, our neural activity intensifies. Our brains are basically on high alert, getting ready for any threat that we might face. And that happens even when there's no actual danger. In studies, uncertainty has been found to cause more stress than inevitable pain. The reason why is because when we know we're going to experience pain, we can mentally prepare for it. Whereas when we're facing uncertainty, the doubt of not knowing what kind of pain, what level of pain is actually more stressful than knowing exactly what's going to happen. This is also why we prefer getting bad news than waiting for an answer. This feels better. Now we know. Even if it's negative, we feel like we're in control. There are 3 subconscious mindsets that get in the way of us living happy, conscious lives. These 3 mindsets are called the cynical mindset, the escapist mindset, and the perfectionist mindset. The cynical mindset is when we have lost all curiosity and ambition in life. And we're actually sometimes even making fun of earnest people who still have this high level of curiosity and ambition. When we're cynical, we feel like there's no point trying because we're in survival mode all the time. So things that we might be doing instead is doom scrolling, sitting on the sofa, going through negative news, being stuck in this cycle, and then maybe even spending a lot of time and energy discussing and debating those negative news with other people. In the escapist mindset, we're still curious, but we have decided to let go of our ambitions. With the escapist mindset, we're trying to do everything we can to escape our responsibilities. That can take the form of retail therapy, binge watching, or dream planning our next vacation instead of doing something right now to change our lives. In the perfectionist mindset, we try to escape uncertainty through work. So we have high ambition but low curiosity. That might look like self-coercion, overworking ourselves, toxic productivity. Our goals are driving all of our decisions. We feel like if we manage to achieve that goal, if we manage to be successful, then we'll be happy. You can picture those 3 subconscious mindsets on the 4x4 matrix, where the 2 different factors are curiosity and ambition. In the case of the cynical mindset, it's low curiosity, low ambition. For the escapist mindset, high curiosity, but low ambition. And with the perfectionist mindset, you do have high ambition, but you have decided to let go of your curiosity. Those mindsets are actually very fluid, and they might change depending on our situation and different triggers and different ambitions that we might have at the moment. This is actually really good news because that means that these mindsets are not fixed personality traits. We can change them by becoming aware of them and then making the decision to change our mindsets. This is something we can achieve.
Don't worry about it. And maybe there's a gentler answer, which is follow your curiosity. Which is a smaller impulse and a lighter one and a less high stakes one than passion. And you don't mortgage your whole house to go follow your curiosity. You just try it for a weekend. Maybe you like it, maybe it's something, maybe it's not. Maybe in the end you kind of embroider a very complex, beautiful patchwork life for yourself. And at the end of your life, maybe you're not at the top of the heap, but you're able to say, I did the most interesting thing a human being can do, which is to follow the slight pollen trail of my inquisitiveness for the entirety of my life. And through that, I cross-pollinated the world and created a beautiful work of art of my own existence. That's not so bad, but it doesn't get a lot of credit in a really competitive, passion passion fetishizing society.
I get it. I guess in that analogy, I consider myself like a humming hammer, maybe. You know what I mean? Like, and I look at everything as seasons. Like in the sports world, there's a preseason, the regular season, the playoff season, then the postseason, right?
Right.
Just like in life, there's 4 seasons. There's 4 seasons to every sport.
Right.
And do
them again. Preseason.
There's the preseason. There's the season, the regular season.
Yeah.
The playoff season.
Right.
And then the postseason.
The postseason. Okay.
And I prepare myself. I go all in on this sport for one season, right? The preseason, we're training mode, 4 or 5 hours a day, getting ready for the regular season. Then grinding it out. Then try to make the playoffs season. Then the playoffs, you try to win the championship. Then afterwards, you evaluate in this moment, like, okay, did I fully love this season? Do I still love this sport? This could be, do I still love writing? Do I still love this career path I'm on? And then in the postseason, I reevaluate. Do I want to cross-pollinate somewhere else and try my curiosity somewhere, another sport or another thing? Or do I go into another preseason or postseason to lead up to the same sport?
Do you leave? It's so funny because I always talk about my writing as seasonal as well. But coming from a farm background, I think of it as agricultural season.
Sure.
Including seasons where you leave the field fallow so that the ground can restore itself.
Yeah.
Seasons where you don't work so that you don't overstress.
Sure.
Rob talks about that too a lot about like.
Yeah, you got to take a break.
You
got to take a break.
Yeah.
Just not train.
So interesting.
Yeah.
But I like that you use that word too, because I use that. But now I'm going to say I'm in postseason right now from my last book.
Postseason is just like you're taking a break, you're evaluating,
you work on your injuries.
You recover, you heal. You heal.
Yeah.
That's what it is. You heal because it's a lot of work. If Tom Brady, are you a big NFL fan?
I'm a big enough NFL fan to be able to follow along with where you're going.
You know what Tom Brady is.
I do know what Tom Brady is.
If Tom Brady was playing a game every weekend for the last 15 years, he'd be broken down.
Yeah.
He needs that 3 months to recover and do whatever he does with Giselle around the world and travel and do what it is.
Think of new ways to be a jerk.
Yeah. I met him. He's actually a pretty nice guy. He's a pretty nice guy. I met him. But he's one of the most focused guys I've ever met.
Yes, he is. He is
committed to his craft.
at his job.
Committed
he
to
is
his craft.
so good at his job.
So, anyways,
he could work on being a better sport, but that's all right. Attitude.
We all have our personality.
You should talk to him about that.
We all have our own personality.
Sorry, Tom, if you're listening to this. You're a very handsome and talented man.
He is, yeah. But it's interesting because I get a lot of people that ask me, how do I find my passion?
Yeah.
But I like your response to it. It's like, maybe you just find what you're curious about right now.
My thing is, if you have one, you'll know it, right? So you shouldn't, if you have one, you won't even be asking that because you're already doing it.
Going for
if you don't have one, take the pressure of that word off your it's just such a pressure word and just keep going back to the word curiosity because you do have that. And the thing about curiosity that I think is interesting is how underestimated it is, because I think a lot of the times people are missing their invitations. There are all these invitations for transformation and for creativity. They're missing them because their eyes are in the wrong place. So their eyes are in the sky looking for the clouds to part. They're looking for Moses to come down with tablets. They're looking for the voice of God. They're looking for the big sign because they think that that's how it comes. And in fact, it's your eyes have to be on the ground looking for the almost invisible trail of breadcrumbs. That's the path, right? And so the breadcrumbs are all around you and people aren't even, their focus isn't there. It's up in the heavens like, where's my sign? Where's my sign? And the other way that curiosity comes, I think, is that tiny little almost imperceptible tap on the shoulder that asks you if you would please turn your head 1/8 of an inch and look a little closer at this thing that you're barely interested in. Just have the most mild little touch of interest. And I feel like people are getting those touches all the time and they're brushing off their shoulders like, where's my sign?
Why are they brushing it? Because
they don't think it's significant. Because it doesn't seem big or important enough. And as soon as that little tap comes, and if you even bother to turn your head 1/8 of an inch and look at it more closely, in that moment you're like, this isn't a thing.
Yeah.
This is nothing. This is like so small and so insignificant, but it is a thing. It's the first clue on the scavenger hunt. It's the first breadcrumb. And I think the foremost sort of shape of my entire creative journey has been about being really trusting of that. You know, like, I don't know why I'm interested in this. I don't even know what this means right now, but I'm going to trust that that's an invitation or the beginning of an invitation.
Right.
And then I'm going to look for the next tiny little tap and the next, you know, breadcrumb. And so it's not, my life hasn't been a series of thunderous epiphanies. It's been a series of tiny whispered invitations, every single one of them.
Okay, so what's really the purpose of life? If you can give an insight on that. Thank you.
Isn't it fantastic that if there's no purpose, you have nothing to fulfill, you can just live? No, but you want a purpose. And not a simple purpose, you want a God-given purpose. It's very dangerous. People who think they have a God-given purpose are doing the cruelest things on the planet. Yes or no? They are doing the most horrible things, and they've always been doing the most horrible things. Because when you have a God-given purpose, life here becomes less important than your purpose. No, life is important. Life is important. When I say life, I am not talking about your family, your work, what you do, what you do not do, your party. I'm not talking about that as life. This is life, isn't it? Life is within you or around you. The ambience of life, you're mistaking the ambience of life for life. Your home, your family, your workspace, your party, this is all ambience of life. This is not life, isn't it? Yes or no? You're mistaking the ambience for the real thing. No. Life is important because it's the only thing you know. You don't know anything else. Do you know something else? Rest is all imagined stuff, isn't it? The only thing is that this is beating and alive, and that's all there is. So is this important? It is of paramount importance. Not you as a person, that's not important. But you as a piece of life, it's very important. Because that is the basis of everything. When I say that is the basis of everything, the universe exists for you only because you are, isn't it? Yes or no? The world exists for you only because you are, otherwise it wouldn't exist in your experience. So, in every way, this is important. So what is the purpose for this? See, if you had a purpose and if you fulfilled it, after that what would you do? Bored, isn't it?
Most people instinctively think that there is some kind of meaning to life. They just sort of assume that it's there. In the same way that if you ask them, why are you getting out of bed? To go to work. Why are you doing that? To make money. Why? To provide for my family. Why? To bring up my children healthily. Why? Because I want my children to be healthy. Why? What do you mean, why? For some people, they just don't recognize the question. They're just like, what are you talking about? For other people, they hear that and they go, gosh, you know what? Fair enough. I actually don't know. The nihilist is someone who sort of takes a bird's eye view of it and realizes that it's all a little bit meaningless. It is nicer to think that you are here for some kind of reason that's written into the rules of the universe than that it all is just a happy or unhappy accident.
there's somebody listening to this that maybe wants to start exploring their why, what's the kind of language or the questions that they should be asking that sort of open up these kind of conversations
for themselves?
Well,
to learn their own why, or
well, first for themselves, but also, well, let's talk about for themselves initially, and then maybe talk about how they can do it with teams that they're part of.
Sure. So to do it for yourself, to learn your own why, first of all, understand that a why is basically an origin story. It's where you come from. We are the products of our upbringing. You know, the experiences you had growing up make you who you are, make me who I am. Your why is fully formed by your mid to late teens, and it doesn't change for the rest of your life. You have only one why. You are who you are. Now, whether you're living in balance with that is a different conversation. Whether you're making the decisions that are of high authenticity, and that's all that authenticity means. Authenticity means the things that I say and the things that I do reflect who I actually am. That's all it means. That's a different conversation. And so when you know your why, the ability to make those choices becomes a lot easier. You know, we've all had the feeling of flow and things like this, except it's a little bit like a roulette game. Like sometimes it happens and sometimes it doesn't. It's like I've done the same thing 1,000 times. How come it doesn't feel good anymore? So here's a fun way you can learn your why. It's called the friends exercise. Go and do this with a best friend. You know, do not do this with a spouse. Do not do this with a sibling. Do not do this with a parent. It doesn't work. Best friend. Somebody who loves you, who will be there for you. They'll pick up the phone at 3 o'clock in the morning and you would do the same for them. And ask them this simple question. Why are we friends? And they're going to look at you like you're nuts, because the part of the brain that controls that deep feeling of love and trust doesn't control language. It's a difficult question to answer. And so they'll say, I don't know. Of course they know. They just don't have the words for it. And so you actually stop asking the question why and you ask the question what. What specifically is it about me? Come on, what specifically is it about me that I know that you would be there for me no matter what? And they'll hem and they'll haw and they'll struggle, and you can't help them and you can't let anybody else help them. You have to let them go through the process. And they'll start describing you. I don't know, you're smart, you're loyal, I trust you, and you play devil's advocate. Good. That's the definition of a friend. You have that with lots of people. What specifically is it about me that I know you would be there for me no matter what? And again, they'll go through a few rounds of complaining and describing you. And eventually they'll quit and they'll start describing themselves. And this is what my friends said to me. They said, I don't know, Simon. All I know is that I can sit in a room with you. I don't even have to talk to you. And I feel inspired. And I got goosebumps. In fact, I'm getting them right now. It happens every time. Because what they did is they put the value that I have in the world into words, and I had the emotional response. And that's what'll happen. Somebody will say something that you will either get goosebumps or you'll well up or something will happen. And that's when you know you've hit it. Because the thing that you give to the world, that you should be working to give to the world consistently, is the reason those people love you. It's the reason why you're not friends with everyone. And if you do this with multiple friends, the amazing thing is they will say very similar, if not the exact same thing, because that's the thing you give to the world. That is your why. It is the reason you get out of bed in the morning. It's a really fun exercise.
So in his Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle argues that everything we do in life is for some further purpose. So I go to school to get an education, I get an education to get a job, and I get a job so that I get money to buy nice things, and so on and so on. But the question Aristotle asks is, what is the end point of all this? What lies at the top of the ladder? And for Aristotle, the point of all human life is to reach happiness. I think it's so elusive because the term itself is so laden. We associate happiness as being this beaming smile with a selfie on social media, but I think happiness is not a smiling face, it's more a smiling soul. But why do we find it confusing? Why is it hard to understand? I think Taoism offers a really good analogy here. So imagine life as like a dense, thorny forest. And in the middle of this forest is a well-paved superhighway. And it's easy to walk along that path. But there are other paths. But these paths go through swamps, they go through thorns, they go up and down hills, and they are difficult. And I think happiness is a little bit like that. There's certain paths to happiness which feel right and are right, but there are so many different paths with their different sirens' calls which attract us. And I think we don't realize we're on the wrong path, often until it's too late, and we find the going really difficult. Hi, my name's Johnny Thompson. I'm the staff writer at Big Think, and I'm the author of the books Mini Philosophy and Mini Big Ideas, and I run the social media account called Mini Philosophy. So I started the Mini Philosophy project about 7 years ago, and the aim was to try to teach philosophy to everybody. The idea was to duck and weave my way through the different philosophical traditions and different philosophical schools. So if you imagine the history of philosophy as some kind of big heat map, that there are certain themes start to emerge. And they're all to do with happiness. They're all to do with how to live the best life and how to be a good person. You have Epicureanism, you have cynicism, you have Stoicism, and you have skepticism. And they're all trying to sell their different version of happiness, and they're literally trying to sell to their disciples that their way is the best way to be happy. And that interested me. But if you zoom out, you do start to notice certain commonalities and certain themes. So if we imagine happiness as being on the right path, if we follow the Taoist metaphor, then the question we've got to ask ourselves is, if we are unhappy, what's going on there? And the question then is about finding the right path again. There are certain lights which emerge in the history of philosophy and theology as well, which are meant to act as beacons or guides with which we can walk towards. It's found in Confucius's idea of right virtue, it's found in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, and it's found in Al-Ghazali's idea that the right way is in accordance with Allah. So if we are unhappy, then we should work towards these lights, and I've identified 3 lights, or what I like to call pillars of happiness. The first pillar, or light number 1, is the idea that happiness is not measured by pleasure. So the ancient Greeks had a lot of different words for happiness, and one of them is hedonia. And hedonia is what we might want to call simple pleasure. It's the big night out with some friends, but it's also drinking a herbal tea on the sofa. It's quite easy to measure and it's quite easy to understand because it's an emotional affect. Eudaimonia, though, is a much harder word to understand. It's often translated as flourishing, and the reason why it's difficult to understand is that it's often understood in reverse. So there are many moments in life where we look back on our experiences and think they were really hard at the time, but actually we were supremely happy. For example, raising young kids or even school can be quite hard at the time, but we look back and think those were moments where I was deeply, supremely happy. So the idea that pleasure is not an essential ingredient to happiness appears in many different philosophical schools. So this idea is central to Buddhism. So Buddhists tend to define pleasure as being a desire satisfied. So I want a drink of water, and so I reach for the water and I drink it, and that gives me a pleasure. But the problem, of course, is that this is an unwinnable game. Every day we have millions and millions of desires, and there's no way we can satisfy them all. It's like a game of whack-a-mole.
You gotta whack the most mole! That's smart!
If we're to be happy at all, it has to be found outside of this notion of pleasure. We have to step beyond hedonia. But the problem is that we risk going too far. It's a logical fallacy to say that just because pleasure doesn't equal happiness, that suffering therefore must. And it's a risk that we fetishize suffering, that we enjoy this kind of masochistic misery and we see that as essential to flourishing. But of course that's not true, and the second pillar, the second light which emerges across all these traditions is moderation, that we have to find a middle way. It's essential to Taoism. And the idea is that life is not black or white, but rather it's a confused and confusing cocktail of things. Everything is grey. So yin tends to represent the dark, the mysterious, the elusive, water, fluidity. And yang tends to represent the exciting, the passionate, the loud, the sunny, and truth. And so for Taoists, we have to find the middle path, which is walking between yin and yang. But this idea of moderation is also seen in everyday life, and it's in the Swedish lifestyle concept of lagom, which means just the right amount. And there's 2 elements to it, really. The first element is a kind of fair usage policy where if I take all of the cookies in the cookie jar, then it leaves none for anybody else. And so what I do will affect other people. The second element of lagom is a kind of recognition that sometimes less really is more. And so, for example, if I'm having a coffee with a friend, that's fun, that's enjoyable. But if I have 7 coffees, it's not so much. And this idea of moderation and balance appears again and again through different threads in philosophy. But the third thing that I noticed appearing is the idea that happiness is an unavoidable emergent state of goodness. That you cannot be truly and meaningfully happy unless you are also virtuous. But of course, this raises a problem, and the problem is, what does virtuous mean? Because if we zoom in on any different culture and any different time, what people define as right and wrong and good and bad will change from person to person, from philosopher to philosopher. So if you look at the history of philosophy, what you find is that certain virtues have always been called virtues and certain vices have always been called vices. I think we can identify 5. The first is altruism and the vice egoism. So this is seen in Augustine's Code for Monks, and it's seen in Islam's Zakat. It's there in Peter Singer and Immanuel Kant and Thomas Aquinas. And the idea is a sense of other-regardedness, charity, and caring for other people. So the second is kindness and cruelty. So this is best represented by the golden mean, which most people are familiar with this from the Gospels, which is do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. But it's not just in the Gospels. It's seen in Sanskrit, in Tamil, in Persian, in ancient Greece, and in the Vedas. But it's also seen in modern times in Kant's first categorical imperative and in Aquinas' natural law. Be good and kind to other people. And the third virtue vice is justice and injustice. I think if you put Plato and Mencius and John Rawls in the same room, they would agree about the need for justice, which is the idea of some kind of retribution for wrongdoers. The fourth virtue vice is wisdom and ignorance. Socrates famously wrote that the unexamined life is not worth living, and the Buddha encouraged his disciples to meditate at great length on the universe. I can't think of any major philosopher who's been treated seriously for long who advocates for ignorance. And the fifth virtue vice is humility and arrogance. And I think this has 2 strands, really. The first is a kind of intellectual humility, which is represented best by John Stuart Mill. And the second is a kind of existential humility, which is represented by the religions. It's in Karl Barth, it's in Maimonides, and the word Islam literally translates as surrender to Allah. This is the idea that you are not the center of the universe. There are things outside of your understanding which are far more powerful and which we occasionally have to bow to. So taking all these together, how can we actually apply these 3 pillars to our day-to-day life? And I think for pillar number 1, which is the idea that happiness cannot be measured by pleasure, I think a really good example of this is parenting. If you ever go on social media and you see a reel or a post about a new parent, it's inevitably moaning about something, their sleep-deprived nights, or the germs, or their kids aren't eating anything, and it's full of stress and what appears to be misery. But then if you commented on those posts saying, well, why did you bother having kids in the first place? Or why do kids make you unhappy? Often parents will reply, I'm the happiest I've ever been. And I think parenting is an example of looking back at a stage of your life and thinking, all of the ingredients might have been pretty hard in themselves. But as a whole, I was deeply existentially happy. Pillar number 2 is the idea of moderation in all things. And I think this is best seen in dieting. So most diets end within a month, or if not weeks, and most New Year's resolutions end pretty quickly. It's, I'm going to go to the gym every day and run half marathons, or I'm going to give up chocolate, or I'm never going to drink alcohol ever again. And they fail because they are so extreme. And the best diets in history allow a degree of flexibility and moderation. So dieting, when it's done at these extremes, does work for some people, no doubt, but for most people, dieting is best when it happens in the middle way. So pillar number 3 is that happiness requires goodness, which might seem ridiculous to lots of people because we can point to people who seem to be pretty cruel or immoral, and yet they seem to be also very happy. But the evolutionary psychologist Robin Dunbar did a study into gossip, and he argued that gossip is a kind of social culling where we talk about the cheaters and the liars and the thieves in our lives so we can shun them from society. Inversely, those who are friendly and kind will be welcomed into society. So what we can conclude is those who are kind and those who are friendly will have friends, and those who have friends are also happy. What I find really interesting is if you zoom out and look at the history of philosophy, you see these 3 pillars emerging. And they act essentially as a diagnostic tool. If you feel you are unhappy in life, you can look at these pillars and think, which of these 3 am I not meeting? Is it that I'm confusing a hard patch of my life with being unhappy? Is it that I'm going to two extremes? Or is it that possibly I'm not being as good as I could be? If we recognize that those are the problems in our life, we can take steps to fix it.
From these philosophical ideas about happiness, I like to switch to concepts and ideas from spiritual resources because I think they tie into that. So the first idea there is that you are not separate. So I'll put some quotes down here. Like the Upanishads say that you are that. You are the divine. Or in one of the Gospels, the Gospel of Luke, it says, the kingdom of God is within you. In Sufi text, it says, you are not a drop in the ocean. You're the ocean in a drop. Or the Hermetic text says, all is one. The Tao, everything is the Tao expressing itself in 10,000 forms. In my text, it says you are the heart of the sky and the heart of the earth. The Buddha says there is no separate self. The Kabbalah says creation is one emanation, divided only in appearance. So that's the first principle. You're not separate. The second one is all about fear being an illusion. Fear means there's something missing. But these spiritual messages tell us love is the truth. Fear is an illusion. You will know the truth and the truth will set you free. Apparently Jesus Christ said perfect love will cast out fear. Buddha apparently says hatred does not cease by hatred, and by love alone is hatred healed. The Bhagavad Gita recommends the path of devotion and love, and it will lead to liberation. And the path of ignorance will give you fear, and it will lead to suffering. Courage comes from love, and paralysis comes from fear, according to the Tao Te Ching. The Dhammapada says, mind is everything, and Rumi Sufis say, your job is not to seek for love, but to remove the barriers you have built against it. That's number 2 on fear. And then the third big threat is that your mind does not observe reality. It creates it. What we think, we learn, the all is mind. In the Hermetic text it says, the world you perceive is shaped by the mind's illusions. Or the Upanishads say the universe arises from consciousness. Plato apparently says reality is the moving image of eternity. So number 4 is around this idea of the sense of self, the narrated story, the ego. So ego apparently is the only real enemy in the sense that it is a block to the awareness of love with a capital L. And then we see that the human stories on the negative flip side are always based in conflict. Of course, war is an extreme in conflict, but just conflict between people, get married, divorce, not speaking to each other anymore, grievances, the whole bloody lot of it. And the second basis is this need for recognition. I need to be recognized. Otherwise my life was lived in vain. And it's this desire for specialness, win Olympic medals, become the prime minister, get a PhD, the list goes on. Recognition and specialness. And then the third basis is this hierarchical need, like I'm more than others. So even if you get put down, you just look for someone weaker than you to put them down so you no longer feel so bad anymore. This idea of control and power. Right, and then number 5 is that everything is connected and we're all influencing each other. So we've seen lots of ideas of consciousness. We've seen ideas on purpose and meaning. But to the best of my knowledge and my experience and my insight is to completely let go of this idea of important meaning, important purpose, but to rather be and live in the moment and be free to live your life without there having to be an ultimate purpose or meaning to it. And if you look, for example, what career you should follow, well, follow Simon Sinek. You were formed, and through that there is a why. An important thing where people can value your contribution, your influence on the whole of humanity and our level of being on planet Earth and level of being in space and time. So for me, it became obvious. And when I ask people the question, like Simon Sinek said, I said, Michael, you're really good to taking complex information and put it in terms that all of us can understand. So it's like, oh, that's fantastic. So naturally I rolled into learning and development. They say you're also quite inspirational, you're very supportive, motivational. Well, I hope those things are true for you. You listen to me, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. But still, that's what I pursued, and I'm achieving the rather a living of, and I'm still doing it at the university here in Brisbane. And these podcasts are in support of the sessions that I do with the people in my classes. I call it mental health and transformation. So to come to the finale of this second podcast, and I will put this in writing as well, are 2 things. Were you ever allowed to think for yourself? So when you were growing up, when you went to school with your parents and neighbors, and you joined a football team or any team, got to high school and then maybe university, or you immediately rolled into a job, were you ever allowed to think for yourself? Because this is one important question. I've written it down. Let me say it correctly. And, okay, yeah. Were you ever promoted to think for yourself? And when you have everything you think you desire, like the job, the family, the house, the cars, the material possessions, the holidays, and all that sort of stuff, what do you really want? In the incredible channel called A Course in Miracles, because Jesus is such a teacher, he tells you to become a teacher of God and join him and all that. It says, it will come to pass that the teacher of God realize there's a simplicity of sorting out his mind. You keep what you want and you let go of what you do not want. But it's an action of mind, really, to speak, is not so much on material possession. And what I say is that there will come a long time what seems to be a very long time for the teacher of God to become clear of what it is that he truly wants. Were you allowed to think for yourself? And is it evident and clear to you what it is that you really want? So not just the career and the money and the partner and the kids and all that kind of stuff. Above all else, above all those things, what is it that you truly want? And would you like to have a sense of individualism? Or do you just desire to be in this singular experience? Is that really true? If you truly desire to be in the singular experience, why aren't you in the singular experience? Are you being played? Are you being submissive? Are you under a master-slave relationship? Is it a true meaning and purpose? Like growing, time means change, so time is the supportive influence to give you a sense that you're growing. Or would you just be happy, rather be happy just to be all-knowing, but not having the experience? Because knowing and experience are two different things. Okay, so I'm going to put this in writing and then leave you with that, and that will be the end of podcast.
You can't really figure what all these people want. Look at yourself. Right now you're thinking you want to become an engineer. Let's say right now I make you an engineer, this moment. Then you're thinking you need a job. I got your job. Then you're thinking you need a promotion. I got you. Then you think you need an award. I got you. Then you think you need wealth. I got you right now. Everything that you can dream of, I got you right now. What do you want now? Yeah, I can do that for you.
Let's say I want a job.
Huh?
I'm striving for a job right now.
Yes. Now, we are looking at the end game, right? You got everything you wanted right now. Things that you can imagine, things that you cannot imagine right now, everything you got right now. What do you want right now?
I wouldn't know what to do.
Just look at it, huh? See, when you say this, what it means is, all you want in your life, what you're seeking is struggle. To get a job, it must take 3 years, then you will feel, wow, I got a job. Look at all the people who have good jobs, look at them walking on the street. Are they going blissfully, dripping ecstasy? Hello? Miserable guys, they're getting blood pressure, going to work. They're getting all kinds of ailments, they're freaking out. Yes? So what do you want?
I don't know anymore.
That's good. I do not know, I like that.